Graceland hummed with a different kind of quiet that evening. Not the usual fanfare of screaming fans or the rumble of a 1,000-pound Cadillac. It was a deep, almost melancholic silence that settled over Elvis Presley as he sat alone in his music room, the velvet drapes pulled tight against the setting Memphis sun. A faint scent of old leather and guitar strings hung in the air, mixed with the lingering sweetness of Priscilla's perfume from earlier. Elvis, in his silk robe, looked out over his kingdom, not through a window, but inward, surveying the landscape of his career. He was king, no doubt about it. His voice could make women swoon, and men stand straighter. He'd conquered stages, screens, and hearts across the globe. Yet despite the thunderous applause and the million-selling records, there was a whisper, persistent nagging murmur that sometimes felt louder than any roar of the crowd. It came from the critics, mostly the highbrow music critics with their fancy words and disdainful sneers. They called his music primitive, crude, lackluster in its musicality. They praised his charisma, his raw energy, his revolutionary style. But they rarely, if ever, praised his pure vocal talent in the way they praised a classical singer. He's a showman, one particularly cutting review had read just last week. He lacks the range, the control, the finesse for anything beyond his simplistic rock and roll tunes. Imagine Presley attempting an aria. Preposterous, preposterous. The word stung. It festered. Elvis traced the worn wood of his acoustic guitar. He closed his eyes, and instead of his own raucous hits, a different kind of music filled his mind. It was grand, dramatic, full of sweeping melodies and powerful, soaring voices. Opera, it wasn't a new fascination. Growing up, he'd devoured all kinds of music. Gospel, blues, country, sure, but also the occasional classical radio program his mother would listen to. He remembered being mesmerized by the sheer power, the raw emotion conveyed through just a voice, without the need for hip-shaking or flashy outfits. It was pure, unadulterated. He'd even experiment a little in his early days, mimicking the operatic vibrato, trying to stretch his voice beyond the bluesy wails and crooning ballads he was known for. He knew his range was wider than people thought. He could hit those high notes, deep notes, hold them, color them. Colonel Parker, his manager, had always steered him away. Elvis, stick to what you know, son. Don't confuse the audience. They want the hip, the rock, the roll. And Elvis had listened. He'd followed the path laid out for him, a path paved with gold records and screaming fans. But deep down, the dream had never truly died. It lay dormant, a quiet ember glowing in the hearth of his soul. Lately, though, those embers had been fanned into a small, persistent flame. Critics' words, meant to diminish him, had instead ignited a defiant spark. They said he couldn't sing opera. What if he could? What if, away from the cameras, the expectations, the Colonel's watchful eye, he truly pushed himself? He stood up, walked over to a bookshelf, and pulled out a thick, leather-bound book. It wasn't about music, but about the human voice. A guide to vocal exercises, breathing techniques, resonance. He'd bought it years ago, almost on a whim, and it had sat unread until now. He flipped through the pages, his thumb tracing the diagrams of diaphragms and vocal cords. It seemed so alien from the raw, instinctual way he'd always sung. Rock and roll was from the gut, from the heart, a primal scream and a tender whisper. Opera, from what he understood, was precision, control, years of rigorous training. Could he, Elvis, Aaron Presley, learn to sing it? Not for the public, not for a new album, but for himself? To silence that nagging whisper? To prove to himself that he wasn't just a showman, but a true vocalist, capable of more than anyone, even he, sometimes imagined. The thought thrilled him and terrified him in equal measure. It was a secret ambition, a wild, audacious dream that he knew he couldn't share with anyone. Not yet, not until he knew if it was even possible. Closed the book, its weight surprisingly comforting in his hand. Outside, the Memphis night was fully dark, but in the music room, a quiet light had just been switched on. A new chapter in the king's life, one that no one would ever expect, was about to begin. And it would start, as most things did with Elvis, with a song, albeit a very different kind. He imagined the pure, powerful notes filling the room, notes that would silence even the most cynical critic. If only he dared to try. The morning sun, usually a welcome guest, felt like an interrogation lamp. As Elvis sipped his coffee on the enclosed porch, Priscilla was still asleep, and the house staff moved quietly, a testament to the usual late hours kept by the king. But sleep had been elusive for Elvis last night. The word preposterous echoed in his mind, amplified by the newspaper clutched in his hand. It was the Memphis Chronicle, a local paper, but they'd picked up a syndicated article from a New York critic, a man named Sterling Vance. Vance was notorious for his acid-tipped pen, particularly when it came to anything he deemed pop culture. The headline screamed, "The King's Limited Kingdom. Why Elvis Presley will never be more than a gimmick." Elvis's jaw tightened as he read. Vance dissected his vocal style, calling it unrefined, lacking subtlety, and incapable of the nuanced phrasing required for serious musical artistry. And then the kicker. One shudders to imagine the king attempting a true operatic aria, a feat surely beyond his raw, uncultivated talent. His voice, while powerful, is a blunt instrument, not a finely tuned violin. He felt a familiar surge of anger, hot and sharp, but beneath it, a colder, more insidious feeling. Doubt. What if they were right? He'd never had formal vocal training beyond a few lessons. When he was very young, before his career exploded, he'd learned on the fly, by listening, by feeling, by instinct. His voice was a gift. Yes, but had he ever truly stretched its limits? Had he explored every corner of its potential? He crumpled the newspaper, the sound like a distant thunderclap in the quiet room. He walked over to his grand piano, a gleaming black monument that often stood more as furniture than an instrument. He rarely played it himself, preferring guitar or letting others provide the accompaniment, but today his fingers, usually so nimble on a fretboard, hesitated over the ivory keys. He remembered a scene from an old movie, a dramatic opera film he'd watched years ago. Tenor sweat beating on his brow, hitting a note that seemed to shake the very foundations of the opera house. It wasn't just power. It was emotion, pure and raw, yet sculpted with incredible precision. He tried to hum a few notes, a simple scale. His voice, even in a whisper, was rich, resonant. Could it float, soar, vibrate with that specific controlled intensity? He spent the next few days in a strange state. He was still Elvis, still my doc, still recording, still performing. But a new habit began to form. When no one was around, usually late at night or early in the morning, he'd put on classical records. Not just any classical, but opera, Maria Callas, Luciano Pavarotti, Leontine Price. He listened with an intensity he usually reserved for new rock and roll demos. He studied their breathing, their phrasing, the way they moved their voices. It was a different muscle, he realized. His rock and roll voice was like a wild stallion, powerful, untamed, magnificent in its raw energy. The operatic voice seemed like a perfectly trained thoroughbred, equally powerful, but disciplined, graceful, every movement calculated for maximum impact. He found himself mimicking passages, quiet at first, then a little louder, when he was sure no one was within earshot. He'd stand in front of his bathroom mirror, watching his throat, his chest, trying to understand how they produced such sounds. He felt awkward, clumsy, like a giant trying to dance ballet. His voice would crack or sound strained or just plain wrong. But then, sometimes for a fleeting moment, he would hit a note, a phrase, and it would resonate. It would feel right. A shiver would run down his spine. A thrill of possibility. One evening, Priscilla found him in the music room, a record of Verdi's Aida spinning softly on the phonograph. He was humming along, not in his usual rock and roll style, but trying to imitate the dramatic baritone. He looked so intense, so focused. A side of him she rarely saw. "Elvis, you all right, honey?" she asked gently, leaning against the doorframe. He jumped, startled, the record needle scratching slightly as he moved too fast. "Priscilla, just listening to some music," she smiled, walking closer. "Verity, that's new. For you sounds intense." She picked up the crumpled Memphis Chronicle from the floor. Her eyes scanned the headline and her smile faded. "Oh, that critic again. Don't listen to him, Elvis. He's just trying to get a rise out of you." Elvis sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Not just him, Priscilla. It's what they all say. That I'm not a real singer, that I only know how to yell and shake, that I don't have range or depth." He looked at her, his blue eyes clouded with a rare vulnerability. What if they're right? Priscilla's heart ached for him. She knew how much he craved respect, not just fame. She sat beside him, taking his hand. "They're not right, Elvis. Your voice is a gift. It moves people like no other, and if you ask me, you've got more range than anyone gives you credit for. You sing gospel, blues, country, rock and roll. You sing whatever you want." She squeezed his hand. "And if you want to sing opera, well, I bet you could do that too. You just gotta believe it." Her words were a balm, but also a challenge. He looked at the discarded newspaper, then at the spinning record. The seed of doubt was still there, but now a new seed had been planted alongside it. The seed of a defiant possibility, nurtured by a quiet, unwavering belief. From the one person who truly saw him. The conversation with Priscilla had lifted a weight from Elvis's shoulders, but it had also solidified his resolve. It wasn't just a passing fancy anymore, it was a mission. And having Priscilla's support, her quiet belief, made it feel less like a foolish dream and more like a secret, exciting project. He found himself spending more time in his music room late into the night, or during those rare hours when Graceland was truly quiet. He started with the basics from the old vocal book, breathing exercises, deep, controlled breaths from the diaphragm, not just his chest. He'd lie on the floor, a book on his stomach, watching it rise and fall, trying to master the technique that felt so unnatural compared to the raw, instinctive power he usually summoned. He hummed scales carefully, quietly, trying to find the resonance points, the places in his head and chest where the sound would vibrate. Most fully, he was used to pouring out emotion, but this was different. This was about control, about placing the sound precisely, about shaping it with an almost scientific precision. Priscilla often found him this way, engrossed in his private practice. She wouldn't interrupt, just watch from the doorway, a soft smile on her face. Sometimes, she'd bring him a glass of iced tea or a plate of his favorite banana pudding, leaving it quietly nearby. Her silent presence was an encouragement in itself. One evening, after nearly 2 weeks of this hidden dedication, Elvis felt a surge of frustration. He'd been trying to hit a particularly high sustained note from a Pavarotti aria, and his voice kept cracking. It felt tight-strained, nothing like the effortless power of the recording. He slammed his hand lightly on the piano key, a discordant thud echoing in the room. "It's impossible, Priscilla," he grumbled, looking up as she entered, carrying a small plate of peanut butter and banana sandwiches. "I sound like a dying cat trying to imitate an angel." She placed the plate down. "Come on now, you've only just started. You didn't learn to shake your hips like that overnight either, did you?" she teased gently, trying to lighten his mood. He managed a small smile. "No, but that came natural. This is like trying to learn a whole new language, a whole new way of singing." He ran a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair, messing it up slightly. "These opera singers, they train for years, decades even. I'm just Elvis." Priscilla sat beside him on the piano bench. "And Elvis is one of the most naturally talented people I've ever met. Do you know how many people would kill to have a fraction of your voice? Your stage presence, you have an instrument. Elvis, maybe it just needs it. You want to prove them wrong, don't you?" That critic, Vance, You want to show him that your kingdom isn't limited. He nodded slowly. More than anything, Priscilla, not just for him, though for me. I want to know if I can do it, if I have that kind of artistry beyond the show. He leaned forward, dropping his voice to a near whisper. I want to record it just once. A private recording, something no one will ever hear. Just for us, for me. Priscilla's eyes widened slightly. This was a statement? A private recording? What about the Colonel? Elvis scoffed. Colonel would have a fit. He'd say it's a waste of time, a distraction. He'd say it would confuse my image. No, this has to be completely under the radar. No one can know. She considered this, then a slow smile spread across her face. A secret mission for the king? I liked the sound of that. So, what would you sing? A full opera? He chuckled. Nah, not a full opera. Maybe just an aria. Something powerful, something that would really showcase well, if I can do it. He paused, a spark lighting up his eyes. Something that would make even Sterling Vance sit up and take notice if he ever heard it. Priscilla laughed softly. I have no doubt it would. But who'd you get an engineer you trust? Musicians? This was the tricky part. Elvis had a large entourage, but few he could trust with something. This crazy, this personal. Most of them would report straight to the Colonel, or accidentally let it slip. That's what I've been thinking about, Elvis said, running a hand through his hair again. There's old Sam Phillips from Sun Records, maybe. He's always been different, respected my voice. Not just the money it made, but he's not really a classical guy, he thought for a moment. Maybe someone from Nashville, someone who's done classical recordings, but who knows how to keep their mouth shut. He began to pace, his energy returning, the frustration replaced by excitement. We'd need a good piano player, maybe some strings, a small ensemble, and an engineer who understands acoustics. Not just electric guitars and drums. Priscilla watched him, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and tenderness. This was the Elvis she loved. Passionate, driven, constantly seeking new challenges, even when the world thought they had him all figured out. This secret project, this desire to prove something to himself, felt deeply authentic. Okay, she said, standing up and pulling him into a hug. Then let's figure it out. This king needs to expand his kingdom, and I'll be your chief strategist. He held her close, a genuine smile on his face. Having her in his corner, believing in his wild dream, made all the difference. The road ahead would be challenging, secretive, and probably full of awkward vocal exercises, but for the first time in a long time, Elvis felt a thrill that wasn't about fame or fortune. It was about pure, unadulterated artistry. And he knew with Priscilla by his side, he had a fighting chance. With Priscilla's blessing and active support, the secret mission truly began. The first step was finding a vocal coach. This was perhaps the trickiest part. Elvis couldn't just call up a renowned opera coach. Word would get out in a heartbeat. Instead, Priscilla, with her usual quiet efficiency, began making discreet inquiries through friends of friends, looking for someone retired, someone discreet, someone who understood the nuances of the classical voice, but wouldn't be starstruck or prone to gossip. They found Mrs. Eleanor Vance, no relation to the critic, thankfully a fact that brought Elvis some ironic amusement. A former opera singer and highly respected vocal instructor who had retired to a quiet life just outside Nashville. She was in her 70s, sharp as a tack, with a no-nonsense demeanor and an unwavering passion for the purity of the human voice. The first meeting was tense. Elvis, accustomed to being adored, was suddenly a student again, albeit a very famous one. Mrs. Vance, however, treated him exactly like any other aspiring singer. She had him sing a simple scale, she said, her expression unreadable as Elvis's rich, powerful baritone filled her small, cozy studio. Good instrument, plenty of power, but a bit wild, wouldn't you say, Mr. Presley? Elvis grinned sheepishly. "You could say that, ma'am. We'll need to tame it," she declared, her eyes twinkling. "Like shaping a bugling secret. Breath, Mr. Presley, is everything. Your rock and roll style relies on raw lung power and natural. It's about control, sustained breath, and finding those head voice notes without straining." So began the grueling, secret rehearsals. 3 times a week, Elvis would make the quiet drive from Graceland to Mrs. Vance's studio, often late in the evening or early in the morning, under the cover of darkness. He'd arrive in an inconspicuous car, usually driven by a trusted security guard, who thought Elvis was simply visiting an old friend. Mrs. Vance was a formidable teacher. She made him do endless breathing exercises lying on the floor singing long, sustained notes. She taught him about resonance chambers in the head, the soft palate, the hard palate. She showed him how to open his throat, how to relax his jaw, how to support the sound from his diaphragm so his throat wouldn't constrict. It was frustrating, incredibly frustrating. Elvis, who could sing the song perfectly after hearing it once, now struggled with a simple phrase from an aria. His voice, so accustomed to the raw, visceral release of rock and roll, felt stiff, uncooperative. He'd hit a high note and it would sound pinched or crack entirely. He'd try to hold a sustained note and his breath would give out. "Poor breath, Mr. Presley. Support it. Feel it in your stomach, not your chest," Mrs. Vance would command, tapping her own abdomen. There were days he wanted to give up. Days he wondered if Sterling Vance was right. If his voice truly was just a blunt instrument. He'd come home exhausted, his throat sore, his ego bruised. But then there were the breakthroughs. Small, exhilarating moments. One day, after weeks of trying, he finally hit a sustained high B flat from a tenor aria, and it soared. It wasn't perfect, but it wasn't pinched either. It was full, resonant, and beautiful. He heard it, and Mrs. Vance's stern expression softened into a rare, approving smile. "Ah, there it is, Mr. Presley," she exclaimed. "The voice is waking up. You see, you have the instrument. You just needed to learn how to play it differently." Those moments kept him going. He started to feel new muscles in his throat, his diaphragm. He started to understand the physics of it, the intricate dance between breath, vibration, and resonance. He began to apply the techniques to his practice arias, pieces from Verdi, Puccini, Bizet. He particularly loved the dramatic, passionate ones, the ones that spoke of love, loss, and grand gestures. Priscilla would often stay up waiting for him to return. He'd tell her about his lessons, the struggles, the small victories. She'd listen patiently, her eyes full of admiration. "You sound different even when you're just talking," she commented one night. "Your voice seems deeper, more resonant," he grinned. "That's Mrs. Vance's magic. She says I'm finally learning to use my full range. Not just the parts I'm used to. The physical demands were immense." He had to be careful not to overdo it, to balance his rock and roll commitments with his secret vocal training. He started drinking more water, avoiding things that would irritate his throat. He felt like an athlete in training, constantly pushing his limits. As weeks turned into a couple of months, his confidence grew. He could feel his voice transforming. It was still unmistakably Elvis, with that unique warmth and power. But now it possessed a newfound control, a refined edge he hadn't known it was capable of. He was ready to try a full aria. Mrs. Vance suggested La Donna e Mobile from Verdi's Rigoletto. It was a classic tenor piece, famous for its lively tune, and the tenor's bravura requiring agility, and a powerful high G. Elvis listened to recordings, then began to tackle it, line by line. He poured his own unique blend of emotion into it, still Elvis, but now with the added layer of operatic technique. The day he finally sang through La Donna e Mobile, without a single crack or strain, hitting the high G with surprising ease and resonance. Mrs. Vance stood up, her face beaming. "Mr. Presley," she said, her voice filled with genuine warmth. "You are ready. You have proven yourself now. What will you do with it?" Elvis smiled. a determined glint in his eye. "Now, Mrs. Vance," he said, "I make my recording." The blunt instrument was being sharpened, honed into something truly magnificent. The time had come for the next step. The biggest hurdle wasn't finding a coach or enduring the grueling vocal exercises. It was the Colonel. Colonel Tom Parker was Elvis's manager, but he was more than that. He was a force of nature, a shrewd businessman who guarded Elvis's image with the ferocity of a junkyard dog. Anything that deviated from the King of Rock and Roll brand was immediately and emphatically shut down. Elvis knew this. He had seen the Colonel's reactions to smaller suggestions over the years, a different style of suit, a slightly more experimental song. Colonel believed in consistency and giving the audience exactly what they expected. And then some. An operatic recording, the Colonel would laugh, then rage, then probably try to turn it into a novelty Christmas album. So the idea of a public opera album was out of the question. It never even crossed Elvis's mind. This was personal. This was for him, for his own vindication, for the sheer joy of pushing his boundaries. But even a private recording required resources, a studio, an engineer, musicians. And those resources, if discovered, would lead straight back to the Colonel. Elvis paced his study. The rich scent of pipe tobacco, an old habit he occasionally indulged in, mixing with the faint aroma of cleaning polish. Priscilla sat quietly watching him, offering silent support. "He'll go," ballistic Elvis muttered, running a hand through his hair. "He'll say it's a waste of time, a waste of money. That it'll leak, and people will think I've lost my mind." "Doesn't understand artistry the way you do, Elvis," Priscilla said softly. "He understands business. And this isn't about business for you, is it?" "No," he said, stopping to look at her, his expression serious. "This is about proving something to myself, that I'm not just a one-trick pony, that I've got more in me than they think." He looked out the window at the sweeping lawns of Graceland, a fortress that sometimes felt more like a cage. "I just want to lay down one track, one aria, to know I did it, to hear it myself." The solution, they realized, had to be absolute stealth. No official studio, no regular session musicians. They needed people who were trustworthy, discreet, and perhaps a little bit off the grid. "Remember that engineer, Bob Gelber?" Priscilla suggested after a moment of thought. "He worked on a few of your early gospel records. He always seemed very quiet, very professional, and he's got his own small studio out near the lake, doesn't he?" Elvis snapped his fingers. "Bob?" "Yeah, Bob's good. He built his own place, barely takes on commercial jobs, says he prefers the purity of sound." He thought about it. Bob Gelber was a meticulous engineer, known for his pristine recordings, especially a vocalist. More importantly, he was a man of few words, known for his integrity. He wouldn't talk, and musicians, Priscilla continued, for a piano, maybe a cello musicians, were a tight-knit community. Word traveled fast. "What about that young pianist who played at the Beale Street Jam session last year?" Elvis mused. "The kid who improvised on that old blues tune. What was his name? Billy Turner. He wasn't a classical player, but he could read anything, and he had real soul. And he cellist." Elvis paced again. "I know a guy from Nashville, an older gentleman retired from the symphony, Mr. Henderson. He played on some of my Christmas albums quietly, in the background, always seemed very reserved. Very proper, and he loved music for music's sake. It was a motley crew, certainly not the usual polished session musicians he worked with, but they had one thing in common: discretion, and a genuine love for music that transcended genres." The next few days were a blur of hushed phone calls and clandestine meetings. Elvis would arrange to meet Bob Gelber at a gas station, or Mr. Henderson at a diner, pretending it was about a minor side project. He was careful not to reveal the true nature of the recording until he had their solemn promise of secrecy. When he finally met with Bob Gelber at his small, well-insulated studio on the outskirts of Memphis, Elvis laid out his plan. "Bob, I need a favor. A big one. Something completely off the books. No one, and I mean no one, can know about this. Bob, a lean man with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, listened intently. What kind of favor, Elvis? I want to record an opera aria, Elvis stated, watching Bob's reaction carefully. Bob's eyebrows shot up. He blinked once, twice, then a slow smile spread across his face. Well, I'll be. That's a new one. Can you sing opera? Elvis? His tone was curious, not mocking. Elvis grinned. That's what I aim to find out. I've been training, but it's gotta be private. No studio name, no session logs, nothing that can be traced back. A one-off for my own ears. Bob considered it. He was a stickler for rules, but he also had a deep respect for artistry. He looked at Elvis, seeing not the king, but a man driven by a genuine artistic impulse. If you're serious, Elvis, and if it's truly just for you, then I can help my studios, soundproofed private, and my lips are sealed. It was a huge relief. Bob's agreement was the linchpin. Next came Billy Turner, the young pianist who, upon hearing Elvis Presley wanted him to play piano for a secret recording, could barely contain his excitement, instantly agreeing to silence. Mr. Henderson, the cellist, a man of quiet dignity, seemed slightly surprised but agreed with a nod, intrigued by the challenge. The date was set for a week later, a Tuesday night when Graceland would be quiet and the Colonel would be out of town on business. The air thrummed with a nervous excitement. Elvis felt a mix of exhilaration and dread. This was it. Culmination of weeks of secret training, the ultimate test. The Colonel's shadow still loomed, a reminder of the public image he had to maintain, the expectations he had to meet. But for one night, Elvis wouldn't be the king of rock and roll. He'd just be Elvis, a man with a voice and a desire to prove, if only to himself, that his kingdom of sound was truly limitless. The day of the secret recording session felt charged with an almost electric tension. Graceland was buzzing with its usual daytime activity. But beneath the surface, for Elvis and Priscilla, there was a palpable sense of anticipation. It felt like planning a heist, but instead of jewels, they were after a moment of pure, unadulterated artistic triumph. Elvis spent the day trying to appear normal, meeting with his band, discussing upcoming tours, but his mind kept drifting to the evening. He did his vocal warm-ups in his bathroom, quiet hums and scales, careful not to attract attention. His throat felt good, rested but ready. Mrs. Vance had given him a strict regimen and he'd stuck to it religiously. As evening approached, a sense of nervous excitement bubbled in his chest. He changed into comfortable, unassuming clothes, a simple shirt and slacks, a far cry from the sequined jumpsuits and silk scarves he usually wore for a performance. This wasn't a performance. It was an exploration. Priscilla helped him prepare a small bag with water, some lozenges, and a backup music sheet. "You've got this, Elvis," she said, smoothing his hair. "Just sing from your heart like you always do." He gave her a shaky smile. "This is different. My heart knows rock and roll. This is a different kind of heart." Around 9 p.m., Elvis slipped out the back entrance of Graceland, getting into a nondescript sedan driven by his most trusted security man. Bread was in, on the general premise that Elvis had a special recording project, but not the operatic nature of it. He was just told to drive and keep quiet. The drive to Bob Gelber's studio, nestled deep in a secluded, wooded area outside Memphis, felt longer than it was. The darkness of the winding country road seemed to amplify Elvis's nerves. What if he failed? What if his voice cracked under pressure? This wasn't like a regular recording session where he could do take after take until it was perfect. This was a raw, vulnerable endeavor. When they finally pulled up to the small, unassuming building, only a single light glowed inside. It looked more like a cabin in a state-of-the-art studio. But Elvis knew Bob Gelber was a master of sound. Soundproofing panels lined the walls and a high-end microphone stood sentinel in the center of the vocal booth. Bob Gelber was already there adjusting equipment, his face calm and focused. "Welcome, Elvis," Bob said, his voice quiet. "Everything's set up. We're alone here." Elvis nodded, a knot tightening in his stomach. Then the door opened again, and Billy Turner, the young pianist, walked in, carrying a worn sheet music folder. He looked even younger, in person, barely out of his teens, his eyes wide with awe and a touch of nervousness. "Mr. Presley," Billy stammered, extending a hand. It's an honor, sir." Elvis shook his hand, smiling warmly. "Billy, just Elvis. Glad you could make it." A few minutes later, Mr. Henderson arrived. The elderly cellist, impeccably dressed in a tweed jacket, his cello case held carefully, he gave Elvis a polite, almost formal nod. "Mr. Presley, a pleasure to be of service." Elvis felt the clandestine team, peculiar mix of seasoned pros and eager newcomers, all bound by a silent agreement of discretion. Bob led them into the main recording area. A beautiful grand piano, polished to a gleam, stood in one corner. Billy's eyes lit up as he sat down, testing the keys. Mr. Henderson carefully took his cello from its case, his movements precise and practiced. "All right," Bob said, his voice cutting through the nervous silence. "Elvis, the vocal booth is ready whenever you are. Billy, Mr. Henderson, we'll start with a sound check for the instruments. Just a few scales, please." Elvis went into the vocal booth, the thick glass separating him from the others. He looked out at the small team. Bob, serious and professional, Billy already lost in the music of the piano, Mr. Henderson tuning his cello with a quiet reverence. They were here for him, trusting him with his strange secret endeavor. Took a deep breath, the diaphragm exercises kicking in automatically. Closed his eyes for a moment, picturing Mrs. Vance hearing her instructions. Breath. "Mr. Presley, support open the throat." The sounds of the piano and cello, soft and rich, filtered through the headphones. It was a beautiful, pure sound. Unlike the electric guitars and drums he was accustomed to, it felt classical right. The microphone stood waiting, an imposing yet inviting presence. This was it. No screaming fans, no flashing cameras, no Colonel Parker. Just him, his voice, and this small, quiet team. The stage was set, not for a concert, but for a personal testament. The moment of truth was approaching, and Elvis was ready to face it, whatever the outcome. The air in the vocal booth felt thick, charged with anticipation. Elvis adjusted the headphones, the faint hum of the studio equipment, a quiet counterpoint to the thumping of his own heart. Could see Bob Gelber through the glass, giving him a thumbs up. Billy Turner sat poised at the piano, his fingers hovering over the keys. And Mr. Henderson held his cello bow ready. "All right." Elvis Bob's voice came through his headphones, calm and steady. "Whenever you're ready, no pressure. Just warm up. Get comfortable." Elvis nodded, took a deep breath, and closed his eyes. He thought of Priscilla's unwavering belief. He thought of Priscilla Vance's sneering article. All of it fueled him. He started with a simple hum, feeling the vibrations in his chest and head. Then scales, slow and deliberate, working his way up and down his range. He focused on keeping his throat open, on supporting the sound from his diaphragm. The notes resonated pure and strong, filling the small booth. Billy began to accompany him softly on the piano, just simple chords following Elvis's lead. Mr. Henderson added a deep, resonant hum on his cello, grounding the sound. It was like a delicate dance, each musician listening intently to the others. Elvis moved on to some of the easier classical pieces he'd been practicing. A gentle folk song arranged classically, then a simple Italian ballad. His voice, usually so vibrant and raw in rock and roll, was now smooth, controlled, yet still imbued with that undeniable Elvis warmth. He wasn't just hitting notes, he was shaping them, coloring them, giving them emotion. Through the glass he could see Bob's reaction. The engineer, usually stoic, had a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. Billy's eyes were wide, fixed on Elvis, a look of pure astonishment on his young face. Even Mr. Henderson, the epitome of reserved composure, had a subtle nod of approval. They were hearing it. They were hearing him. Elvis Presley singing something entirely unexpected. And they were recognizing the artistry. He sang for about 30 minutes, moving through different vocal exercises and simple pieces, building his confidence. He felt his voice settling and finding its rhythm in this new classical landscape. The initial nervousness began to dissipate, replaced by a growing sense of exhilaration. He wasn't just performing, he was exploring. "That sounds beautiful, Elvis," Bob's voice said in his headphones. "Your voice is incredibly clear. Are you feeling ready for the main event?" Elvis took another deep breath, the biggest one yet. This was it. The aria he'd chosen. The one he'd labored over, dreamed about, and sometimes despaired over. Nessun Dorma from Puccini's Turandot. It was a notoriously difficult piece, a true showstopper for a tenor famous for its soaring high B and the dramatic crescendo that culminates in a sustained, powerful final note. If he could sing this, truly sing it, then he would know. He picked up the sheet music from the stand in front of him. Though he knew the words and melody by heart now, he had the lyrics translated in his head, the story of the unknown prince, the sleepless night, the triumph of love. It was a story as dramatic as any of his own ballads, but told with a grander scale. Bob gave instructions to Billy and Mr. Henderson. "Okay guys, Nessun Dorma. This is the one, Billy. Remember the dynamics, that slow build. Mr. Henderson, keep that cello line strong. It's the anchor." The music started soft and haunting, Billy's piano echoing the opening strings of an orchestra. Mr. Henderson's cello joined in a deep, mournful sound. Elvis closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him, immersing himself in the emotion of the piece. He opened his mouth, and the first lines flowed out surprisingly smooth, confident. "Nessun Dorma, Nessun Dorma, nobody shall sleep, nobody shall sleep." His voice, usually vibrant with a rock and roll edge, transformed. It wasn't the voice of Pavarotti. No, it was distinctly Elvis, but refined, controlled, imbued with a newfound precision. The power was there, the emotion was there, but now it was sculpted. Poured every ounce of his being into the notes, the story, the raw yearning. Through the glass, Bob Gelber leaned closer to his mixing board, his eyes fixed on the meters, but his head nodding, almost imperceptibly. Billy Turner's mouth was slightly agape, his fingers dancing on the keys with a renewed intensity. Mr. Henderson, his eyes closed, swayed gently with the music, his cello singing along with Elvis's voice. The first part of the aria flowed each phrase, building, gaining momentum. Elvis felt the music inside him, a powerful current. He was in the zone, completely lost in the moment. He was no longer Elvis Presley, king of rock and roll. He was just a singer in a quiet studio, pouring his heart out to an ancient, beautiful melody. True test, the soaring climax of the aria was just ahead. The music swelled, building in intensity. Elvis was completely immersed, his eyes closed, feeling the vibrations deep within his chest. The story of the sleepless night, the triumph of love, coursed through him. He reached the middle section of Nessun Dorma, where the tension truly mounts. The phrases, growing longer, more demanding. "Ma il nome mio, Nessun saprà. But my mystery is locked within me. My name no one shall know." His voice, while powerful, was controlled, focused. He demonstrated the breath support Mrs. Vance had drilled into him, sustaining the notes with surprising ease. He could feel his throat open, resonating, producing a sound that was rich and full, unlike anything he'd ever produced publicly. Billy's piano accompaniment was impeccable, following every nuance of Elvis's phrasing, adding the necessary drama. Mr. Henderson's cello provided a deep, soulful counterpoint, a comforting anchor to Elvis's soaring voice. Then came the bridge, the section that leads to the famous climax, "De ligua o note tramontate, stelle all'alba vincero, vanish, O night. Set stars, at dawn I will win." Here, Elvis's unique artistry truly shone. He imbued the words with a raw, almost desperate hope, a yearning that was distinctly his own. His voice soared, filling the booth, penetrating the soundproofing. It was still Elvis, yes, the king of rock and roll, but it was an Elvis. Few had ever heard it was an Elvis. Who could sing opera through the glass? Bob Gelber had stopped adjusting knobs. He was simply listening, his expression a mixture of awe and disbelief. He'd recorded Elvis for years, captured his raw power and charisma, but this was different. This was a refined power, a controlled passion. The sound coming through the speakers was pristine, resonant, absolutely captivating. Billy Turner, lost in the music, had tears welling in his eyes. He'd never heard anything like it. He'd known Elvis had a great voice, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. The depth, the beauty, the sheer vocal command, and then came the moment, the high B-flat, the note that defined the aria, the one that separated the true tenors from the rest. Elvis took a deep breath from his diaphragm, pushing the air up, opening his throat, and the note came out. Vincero, I will win. It wasn't just a sound. It was a triumphant declaration. It was held, sustained, pure and ringing, filling every corner of the studio. It was powerful, yet perfectly controlled with a vibrato that was natural and rich. He hit it, held it, then released it, smoothly transitioning to the final triumphant phrase. Vincero, Vincero, I will win, I will win. The final note, a sustained, powerful G, resonated with emotion. A full, unwavering sound that hung in the air for a long moment after the music faded. The only sound in the studio was the soft hum of the equipment and the distant chirping of crickets outside. Elvis stood in the vocal booth, chest heaving slightly, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. He had done it. He had truly, unequivocally done it. Through the glass, he saw Bob slowly push himself away from the mixing board, his jaw slightly slack. Billy Turner had both hands on the piano keys, his head bowed, a silent tear tracing a path down his cheek. Mr. Henderson had lowered his cello, his eyes closed, a look of profound respect and wonder on his face. Then slowly, almost tentatively, Bob Gelber reached for the intercom. "Elvis," he said, his voice hoarse, a tremor in it. That was extraordinary. I've never heard anything quite like it." Billy lifted his head, his eyes shining. He didn't speak, just gave Elvis a silent, reverent nod. Mr. Henderson opened his eyes, meeting Elvis's gaze. He offered a small, dignified smile, a gesture that spoke volumes. Elvis felt a surge of emotion, relief, pride, and a deep, quiet joy. He hadn't just proven them wrong, he'd proven it to himself. He had extended his voice, his talent, his artistry into a realm no one thought he could reach. The king of rock and roll had for one breathtaking moment become an opera tenor, and the proof was now on tape. The silence in the studio stretched for a moment longer, pregnant with the afterglow of Elvis's performance. Then, slowly, Elvis pushed open the heavy door of the vocal booth and stepped out. He felt light, almost weightless, as if a monumental burden had been lifted. "How was it?" he asked, his voice a little hoarse, but a genuine smile spreading across his face. He knew how it felt to him, but he wanted to hear it from them, the witnesses. Bob Gelber was the first to speak, his professional demeanor momentarily forgotten. "Elvis, that was magnificent. Truly, I've recorded some of the best voices in the world, but the power, the control, the emotion. It was like hearing you for the first time." He shook his head, still a little stunned. "Critics who say you can't sing anything but rock and roll, they're deaf or crazy." Billy Turner, the young pianist, could only manage a choked whisper. "Mr. Presley, sir, that was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. You were like an angel." He looked at Elvis with an almost worshipful gaze. Mr. Henderson, the usually reserved cellist, surprised them all by stepping forward and extending his hand. "Mr. Presley," he said, his voice rich with genuine respect, "as a classically trained musician, I must say that was an exemplary performance. Your breath control, your phrasing, truly remarkable. A testament to your dedication and your natural gifts. It was an honor to play for you tonight." Elvis shook each of their hands, feeling a warmth spread through him that was more satisfying than any public applause. This was different. This was pure, unvarnished recognition from fellow musicians who had witnessed his hidden truth. "Thank you, all of you," Elvis said, his voice thick with emotion. "For coming, for believing in this crazy idea, and for your silence." Bob nodded solemnly. "Consider it done. This recording, it never happened. It's just for you, Elvis." He turned back to his mixing board. "Would you like to listen back?" Elvis nodded eagerly. As the first notes of Billy's piano filled the studio, followed by Mr. Henderson's cello, Elvis felt a shiver. Then his own voice, surprisingly clear and strong, soared into the famous lines of Nessun Dorma. He sat there, eyes closed, listening intently. It was him. His voice. But it was also something new. Power he knew was there. But it was harnessed, directed with an almost delicate precision. The high B flat, the vincero. It was powerful, resonant, without strain. It was everything he had hoped for, and more. When the last note faded, and the room was silent again, Elvis felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. He had done it. He had silenced the critics, not in public, but in the most important audience of all, his own heart. Bob carefully removed the master tape from the reel-to-reel machine. It was a compact, unassuming reel. But to Elvis, it contained a treasure beyond measure. "Here you go, Elvis," Bob said, handing it to him. "The one and only copy." Elvis took it, cradling it in his hands as if it were spun gold. "Thank you, Bob. More than you know." He spent a few more minutes thanking Billy and Mr. Henderson again, assuring them they would be compensated generously, and reiterating the need for absolute secrecy. They all readily agreed, their faces still reflecting the wonder of what they had just witnessed. As Red drove Elvis back to Graceland in the pre-dawn hours, the city still asleep, Elvis clutched the tape. The world outside still saw him as the rock and roll icon, the hip-shaking showman. They would continue to write their articles, dissect his style, and claim his limitations. But they didn't know. They couldn't know. He slipped into Graceland quiet as a shadow and found Priscilla waiting for him in the living room, curled up on the couch, a book in her lap. She looked up, her eyes immediately going to the tape in his hand. She didn't ask questions, just smiled, a soft, understanding smile that spoke volumes. "So," she whispered, her eyes shining with anticipation. Elvis just nodded, unable to articulate the depth of his feelings. He held up the tape. "We did it, Priscilla." She got up and walked over to him, wrapping her arms around him in a tight hug. "I knew you could," she whispered against his shoulder. "I always knew." He held her, the tape pressed between them. This was his private victory, a silent, personal triumph. It wouldn't change his career, wouldn't silence the public critics, but it had changed him. It had given him a profound sense of fulfillment, a quiet confidence that transcended fame and fortune. He was a complete artist in ways the world didn't yet understand, and that was enough. The master tape, containing Elvis Presley's operatic triumph, found its home in a locked, fireproof safe, deep within Graceland, a secret known only to Elvis, Priscilla, and the three trusted musicians who had witnessed its creation. It was a tangible testament to a private victory, a symbol of a dream fulfilled away from the blinding glare of public expectation. Life went on. Elvis continued to be the king of rock and roll, performing to sold-out crowds, recording hit after hit, and captivating millions with his unique blend of charisma and raw vocal power. Critics continued their endless dissection of his artistry, some praising, others dismissing. Sterling Vance, the particularly scathing critic, published another article a few months later, lamenting the stagnation of Presley's vocal range. But now those words no longer stung. The same way when Elvis read them, a quiet smile would play on his lips. He knew the truth. He knew what he was capable of. Private recording had given him an unshakable inner peace, a confidence that no amount of public critique could erode. He continued his vocal exercises, not as intensely as during the pre-recording phase, but enough to keep his voice flexible and strong. Sometimes late at night, Priscilla would find him humming operatic melodies or softly singing a phrase from Nessun Dorma. It was a part of him now, a deep, resonant chord in the symphony of his life. The secret project had changed him in subtle ways. He approached his regular recording sessions with a renewed focus on vocal technique, on breath control, on shaping the notes with more intention. While his style remained unequivocally rock and roll, there was a newfound richness, a deeper resonance in his ballads, a more controlled power in his rockers. Some fans and musicians noticed it, commenting on his growing vocal maturity, but they couldn't pinpoint why. He would occasionally exchange quiet, knowing glances with Billy Turner, if they ever crossed paths at a music industry event. Billy, who went on to become a highly respected session pianist, never spoke a word of that night, maintaining the sacred trust. Mr. Henderson, the cellist, sent a Christmas card every year, a simple message of respect and admiration without a single mention of opera. Bob Gelber, the engineer, remained the epitome of discretion, continuing his quiet work in his secluded studio. The secret never leaked, the Colonel never knew, the world never heard, and that was precisely the point. This wasn't about fame or proving anything to the masses. It was about pure artistry, about fulfilling a personal challenge. It was about Elvis, the man, pushing his boundaries, exploring the depths of his talent, not for public consumption, but for his own soul. Tape remained in the safe, a quiet monument to his versatility. Sometimes on a particularly reflective night, Elvis would retrieve it. He and Priscilla would sit together, the soft glow of the record player lighting their faces as they listened to the familiar, yet still astonishing sounds of Nessun Dorma, sung by the king of rock and roll. Priscilla would lean her head on his shoulder, tears sometimes welling in her eyes at the sheer beauty and unexpectedness of it. For her, it was a profound symbol of the man she loved, endlessly talented, perpetually curious, and always full of surprises. Elvis would just listen, a profound sense of contentment settling over him. The soaring notes, the powerful crescendo, the triumphant vincero, they were not just sounds. They were an echo of his own journey, his own quiet victory against the voices of doubt, both external and internal. He was Elvis Presley, the legend, the king. But he was also a man who had proven in the most private and intimate way that his voice was a truly limitless instrument, capable of beauty and power in any genre. He had silenced his critics not with a public retort, but with a quiet, beautiful truth hidden away, cherished, and forever a part of his extraordinary legacy. The story of the king's operatic dream remained a secret, a heartwarming testament to the profound and often unseen depths of true artistic genius.